7:32 a.m. February 10, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Thach squinted into the blinding Pacific sky over Wake Island as 6 Japanese Zeros dropped from the sun, diving straight toward his 4F Wildcats. He had maybe 90 seconds to save his men or watch them burn. Thach was 37 years old. He had logged 214 flight hours in Wildcats. Not a single kill to his name against the enemy they now faced. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters that morning. Fast, agile killers meant to wipe American patrols from the sky. The math was cruel and precise. The Zero turned tighter, climbed faster, and outmaneuvered the Wildcat at every altitude. It took a Zero just 14 seconds to get behind a Wildcat in a turning fight. 14 seconds to line up the guns. 14 seconds to kill. By February, U.S. Navy records showed 43 Wildcats lost in dogfights against Zeros. 43 times American pilots tried to outturn the enemy. 43 funerals. The outcome never changed. American sees a Zero. American turns to engage. Zero turns tighter. Zero wins. Command kept repeating the same doctrine. Avoid turning engagements. Disengage if possible. But turning away meant leaving your wingmen to die. It meant watching Zeros rake your friends with machine gun fire while you ran. Thach commanded Fighting Squadron 3, 4 Wildcats, for pilots, for men, depending on him, to keep them alive. But he had no answer for the Zero. No answer for its agility. No answer for the slaughter happening in the skies every day. 3 days before the attack over Wake, Thach sat alone in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, staring at a box of matches his wife had mailed from home. 20 wooden sticks in a thin cardboard sleeve. He'd been turning the Zero problem over in his head for weeks. How do you beat a faster, more maneuverable enemy flown by veteran pilots with years of combat experience? He pulled 2 matches from the box, held them side by side. Then, he began to weave them in and out of each other. Cross, recross, always connected, always covering. A thought clicked. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight alone? What if they stayed together, weaving, crossing, baiting the enemy? If a Zero got behind one Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The second Wildcat would turn toward him. Their flight paths would cross, and the Zero, focused on its target, would fly straight into the other Wildcat's guns. It was radical. No manual in the U.S. Navy suggested this. Fighter doctrine said you split up once the fight started. Dogfights were 1 versus 1. That's how it had always been done. But 1 versus 1 got you killed. That was how every American fighter pilot had been trained since 1918. Break apart, fight solo, rely on skill and instinct. But Thach couldn't stop seeing those matchsticks crossing in his hand. Couldn't stop thinking about 43 dead pilots who had followed the manual and died anyway. 3 nights earlier, in his dimly lit quarters, Thach had called in his wingman, a young, sharp-eyed pilot named Lieutenant Edward O'Hare. Thach laid out 2 matches on his desk and began to weave them together like threads on a loom. He explained the idea. A pair of planes flying not alone, but in sync. Cross-covering. Turning into each other instead of away. O'Hare stared for a long moment, absorbing the madness of it. Then he looked up and asked one question. When do we test it? That was 4 days ago. Now, Thach had his answer. 6 Zeros. 4 Wildcats. 11,000 feet. Closing fast. The Japanese fighters dropped from the sky like falling blades. The Wildcats held their altitude, 8,000 feet, arrayed in a staggered line. Thach and his wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Edward Bassett, flew side by side, 800 feet between them. Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Carlson flew another 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. For planes, outnumbered, outmatched, doctrine said they should break, scatter, make themselves harder to track. But Thach's hand moved to the radio and gave a command no American pilot had ever spoken in combat. Bassett on me. Weave pattern. Execute. Bassett turned hard left. Thach turned hard right. They flew straight at each other. On the Japanese side, the formation of Zeros saw it happen, probably assumed panic. 2 American fighters flying directly into a mid-air collision. But it wasn't panic. It was math. At 400 yards, Thach and Bassett broke again. Thach banking hard left, Bassett rolling right. They crossed with 200 feet of air between them and continued the pattern, coming back around in a wide figure eight. Looping, weaving, covering each other's six. Like the matchsticks. The Zeros descended 10,000 feet, 9,000, now 8,000. 1-0 pilot locked onto Bassett. Classic move. Get behind. Get close. Use the superior agility of the Zero to hammer the target at point blank with 20mm cannon. The Japanese pilot committed. 700 yards. 600, locked in. He had no idea what was coming. Bassett didn't flee. He didn't turn away like the manual said. He turned toward Thach. The Zero followed. 500 yards. 400, guns hot. And then, just like Thach had imagined, everything changed. At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thach watched 6 Japanese Zeros dive toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island, knowing his pilots had maybe 90 seconds to live. He was 37 years old. 214 flight hours in a Wildcat. 0 kills against zeros. The odds were math. Brutal and simple. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could climb faster, dive sharper, and turn tighter than any American fighter. Everyone knew it, especially the men who faced them. The Zero could outturn a Wildcat in just 14 seconds. That's all it took. 14 seconds to slide onto your 6. 14 seconds to fire. 14 seconds to die. By February, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in one-on-one dogfights with Zeros. Same story every time. An American pilot spots a Zero. He turns to engage. The Zero turns tighter. The Zero wins. Fighter Command knew this. Sent the same orders again and again. Avoid turning fights. If you see a Zero, run. But running meant leaving your wingman behind. Meant watching Zeros strafe your buddies while you escaped. Thach commanded Fighting Squadron 3. 4 men. 4 Wildcats. And no answers. No counter to the Zero's agility. No solution, just more funerals. But 3 nights earlier, something strange happened in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego. His wife had sent him a small care package. Inside, 1 matchbook. 20 wooden matches. Thach took 2, held them side by side in his hands. Then he began to weave them. Cross. Cross again. Never separate. A thought hit him like a lightning bolt. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight alone? What if they wove like those matches, flying in a crisscrossing pattern? If a Zero latched onto 1 Wildcat's tail, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They'd cross. And the Zero would fly directly into the 2nd Wildcat's guns. It was insane. It violated every piece of doctrine since 1918. Fighters didn't do this. You stayed in pairs for navigation, not for combat. When the fight started, you split up. 1 versus 1. That was gospel. Thach didn't care about gospel. He cared about the 43 pilots who were already dead. That night, he called in his wingman, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare. Showed him the matches. Explained the pattern. O'Hare stared at the sticks for 30 seconds. Then looked up and said, "When do we test it?" For days later, over Wake, Thach got his test. 6 Zeros. Diving from altitude. Sun at their backs. 4 Wildcats. 2 formations. Thach and Lieutenant Ed Bassett, 800 feet apart. Behind them, another pair. Ensigns Dan Sheedy and Edgar Carlson. Standard doctrine said, split up, scatter, fight solo. Thach broke the rule. He keyed his radio. Bassett on me. Weave pattern. Execute. Bassett turned toward Thach. Thach turned toward Bassett. They flew straight at each other. To the Japanese, it must have looked like panic. Or suicide. 2 Wildcats on a collision course. But at 400 yards, they banked hard. Crossing paths just 200 feet apart. A perfect figure eight began. A weave. Back and forth. Crossing again. 2 fighters flying as one. 1-0 picked Bassett. Dropped him behind him. 600 yards. Closing. The pilot likely smiled. This was routine. Get close. Stay tight. Wait. Fire. But Bassett didn't run. He turned into Thach. The Zero stuck to him. At 400 yards, Bassett was dead to rights. 3 seconds from cannon fire. But then, Thach came screaming into the weave from the other side. The Zero pilot looked up and saw his own death. Thach opened fire at 300 yards. 6. 50 caliber machine guns lit up. 70 rounds per second. The Zero pilot had one choice. Break off. Or fly into a wall of bullets. He broke. Pulled hard right. Climbed. Disengaged. The other Zeros hesitated. The prey had turned into a trap. Sheedy and Coulson saw what had happened. Without hesitation, they mirrored the move. Sheedy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheedy. Two more Wildcats started weaving. Another Zero latched onto Coulson's 6 for 100 yards. Then Sheedy crossed into the path. Fired. The Zero flinched. Peeled off. Gone. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Zeros. 4 Wildcats. When it was over, all 4 Americans were still flying. Not one hit. Not one lost. Thach landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later. His hands shook on the controls, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The weave had worked. The math was finally changing. He filed a combat report that afternoon. Described the maneuver. Diagrammed it. Called it the Thach weave. Recommended immediate adoption across the fleet. The reply came 3 days later. Interesting tactic. Needs further testing. Not approved. Thach read the words and saw the names of the next 43 pilots already written between the lines. But he didn't wait for permission. Because in 68 days, he'd face 50 Zeros with 8 Wildcats over a place called Midway. And the weave would face its ultimate test. One squadron commander told him flat out, the weave violates every rule of fighter combat. You don't fly toward another aircraft during a dogfight. You'll panic. You'll misjudge. You'll crash. You'll get both pilots killed. But John Thach kept teaching it anyway. Because by May 1942, 91 American pilots had died trying to dogfight Zeros. 91 Wildcats downed. 91 funerals. 91 letters sent home in brown envelopes with crisp salutes and empty comfort. And still, Fighter Command issued the same tired orders: avoid engagement. Run if outnumbered. They might as well have written, good luck. You're on your own. Then came the intercept. In late May, Navy codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor cracked a flurry of Japanese radio transmissions. It wasn't routine chatter. It was an operational blueprint. A massive one. For aircraft carriers. 270 aircraft. The largest Japanese carrier assault ever attempted. Target, Midway Island. Date, June 4th. Admiral Chester Nimitz saw the decoded messages. Understood the stakes instantly. If Midway fell, Hawaii was next. He called every available carrier to Pearl Harbor. America had 3, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet. The Japanese had 4, plus 2 years of air combat experience. Plus 0 fighters that outflew, outclimbed, and outgunned anything the U.S. Navy had in the sky. It was a math problem with no answer. 3 carriers, 8 Wildcats, 50 Zeros, and a volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific, Midway, with one vulnerable airstrip the Japanese planned to bomb into oblivion in the first 30 minutes. On May 26th, Thach got the orders. Fighting Squadron 3 was to deploy to USS Yorktown. Carrier operations. Immediate combat readiness. He read the page, folded it once, slid it into his flight jacket, and understood exactly what it meant. His squadron was about to fight for their lives. That night, he gathered his pilots on the flight line. 7 men. 7 Wildcats. 7 chances. Each one betting everything on a trick with 2 matchsticks the Navy still hadn't approved. Thach didn't sugarcoat it. The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway. Maybe more. We'll have 8 Wildcats. He paused. Looked at their faces, some barely out of flight school, most never having seen a Zero in real combat. The only way we survive is the weave. The only way we protect Yorktown is the weave. The only way we win is the weave. Someone finally asked the question they were all thinking. What if it doesn't work? What if we weave and the Zeros just shoot us anyway? Thach didn't lecture. He didn't command. He just pulled 2 matches from his pocket, held them side by side, then slowly moved them through the air, crossing, turning, back again. Not breaking formation. Not letting go. You don't survive this war alone, he said. But if you weave with your wingmen, you give each other a chance. That was all he had. No secret weapons. No better planes. Just geometry and trust. USS Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th. For days to Midway. For days to prepare for the battle that would decide the future of the Pacific. Thach didn't know who would come back. But he knew one thing. They wouldn't go down fighting alone. 4 days to pray a matchstick trick would work. Because on the morning of June 4th, 1942, at 0930 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Thach looked up and saw something no American pilot had ever faced. a sky black with Japanese fighters. He was flying at 14,000 feet, circling above the USS Yorktown, when the first enemy wave broke through the cloud layer. 18 Aichi D-3 aviation dive bombers, 12 A6 M0 escorts. Not 50, not the full wave intelligence had warned about, but 12 zeros meant 3-1 odds against Thach's four-man section. And 12 zeros was more than enough to die. They were flying high, 15,000 feet, classic Japanese doctrine. On the altitude, dive on the Americans. Hit fast, hit hard. Thach counted their formation, counted his own. 4 Wildcats. His hand moved to the radio. Weave pattern. Execute on my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Edward Bassett, was 600 feet off his right wing. 2 more Wildcats followed behind. The zeros committed. 3 broke hard toward Thach. For Dove for Bassett. The rest dropped through the formation, heading straight for Yorktown. Mark. Execute. Thach turned toward Bassett. Bassett turned toward Thach. They crossed at 12,000 feet, slicing through each other's contrails in a perfect figure eight. The 3 zeros chasing Thach suddenly had a problem. He was flying straight at another Wildcat, and that Wildcat had 50 caliber machine guns pointed at them. The lead zero pilot hesitated. Just 2 seconds. But at combat speed, that's 400 yards, and that was all Thach needed. He came through the weave and opened fire. 50 caliber rounds chewed through the zeros cowling. Smoke exploded from the engine. The fighter rolled hard left, trailing fire. Thach's first kill. But the other 2 zeros didn't panic. They'd seen the weave, and they adapted. Instead of chasing Thach in a line, they split. 1 high, 1 low, forcing Thach to choose. He went high. Bassett went low. The weave broke. For 6 seconds, the 2 Wildcats fought alone. Exactly what Thach had built the weave to prevent. The high zero got behind him, 800 yards. Cannons opened up. 20 millimeters fire hammered Thach's left wing. 2 shells ripped through the wing root. 1 round punched through his canopy, 3 inches from his head. He felt the blast. Felt the metal shrapnel in his flight suit. Kept turning. Then Bassett's voice crackled through the radio. I'm hit. Repeat. I'm hit. Thach snapped his head left. Bassett's Wildcat was trailing coolant. White smoke poured from his engine. The low zero was still on him, pressing the kill. Thach didn't hesitate. He broke off his turn, rolled over, and dived toward Bassett. The weave was broken, but the idea hadn't died. Protect your wingman. Always protect your wingman. Thach came down from 7 o'clock high. 600 yards. 500, 400. He opened fire. The zero disintegrated midair, ripped apart by gunfire. Wing fragments spiraled into the Pacific. Bassett's Wildcat shuddered, dropping altitude fast. Engines overheating, Bassett radioed. Heading back to Yorktown. Go, Thach said. He ordered the 2 other Wildcats to escort Bassett home. Now it was just him, alone at 11,000 feet. 10 zeros still in the sky. The weave only worked with a wingman. Now Thach was just another Wildcat pilot, outnumbered, outflown, trying not to die. He turned back toward Yorktown. Started descending. 30 seconds later, 3 zeros spotted him. They turned to intercept. Thach looked left. Spotted 4 Wildcats, 3 miles east. Too far to reach him in time. This was it. Everything he'd trained for. Every pattern he'd drawn on blackboards. Every matchstick demonstration in the ready room. And now he was flying solo. But John Thach still had one thing going for him. He knew exactly what those zeros expected him to do. And he was about to surprise them. The 3 zeros were closing fast. Thach had no wingman, no weave, no backup, no options, except run. But running meant dragging 3 zeros straight to Yorktown. Straight to the carrier his squadron was supposed to protect. Thach wasn't going to do that. He keyed the radio. Engaging 3 zeros solo, he said. If this works, you'll see it. If it doesn't, tell my wife I love her. Then he pushed the stick forward, rolled into a turn, and did something no U.S. Navy pilot had ever done alone. He flew straight at 3 zeros. 9,000 feet. 3 enemy fighters in firing range. No wingman to weave with. Just 1 Wildcat and a matchstick idea. But Thach had spent 4 months thinking about the weave. For months dissecting its logic. For months staring at geometry in motion. And now he realized something that changed everything. The weave didn't need 2 planes. It needed 2 points in space. If he could fly like 2 fighters, if he could mimic the geometry, He could force the Zeros to react, to chase shadows, to bleed energy. He yanked the stick hard right, then immediately reversed, hard left. Not smooth turns, not traditional dogfighting, just sharp, jagged angles that broke the rhythm of pursuit. The lead Zero committed to the right turn, but Thach was already slicing back left. The Zero overshot, corrected, pulled harder, burned speed, burned altitude. Thach reversed again, right, then left. The second Zero tried to cut him off, but Thach wasn't flying a pattern. He was flying chaos, predictable only in its unpredictability. Every reversal drained the Zeros of their energy advantage. They were reacting, not attacking, chasing, not killing. After 40 seconds, the lead Zero was no longer above him. They were co-altitude, same speed, same fight, no advantage. The Zero pilot realized it too. He broke off, pulled into a climbing right turn, retreated. The second and third Zeros followed. Thach leveled out, breathing hard. Alive. Alone. He had just proven something that would change the Pacific Air War. The principle of the weave didn't require a wingman. Only control. Only angles. Only will. He flew back toward Yorktown. Landed 20 minutes later. Bassett's Wildcat was already on deck, riddled with holes, but still in one piece. The other two pilots were in the ready room. When Thach stepped inside, the room went quiet. Every pilot had seen what he'd done. 1 Wildcat. 3 Zeros. No kills, but no deaths either. And that was the point. Survival was the victory. By that evening, word had spread across Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. Thach's weave works, even solo, even outnumbered. Pilots crowded into the ready room. Men from other squadrons. Men who'd already written mental letters home. Men who'd watched friends die trying to outturn Zeros. They didn't want theory. They wanted answers. Thach pulled out his matches. Again, laid them on the table, showed the weave, showed the reversals, drew the figure 8 on the chalkboard. He didn't promise miracles, didn't claim dominance, only a way to survive. And for pilots who'd seen Zeros tear through Wildcat formations like paper, that was enough. That night, on the eve of the Battle of Midway, American pilots didn't just fly smarter. They flew together. Some pilots tested it that night. Low passes over the dark sea, weaving in pairs through the moonlight, practicing timing. One turn, cross, reversal. Again, over and over. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could fly the weave in formation. By June 6th, it was 32. No memos, no directives, just word of mouth and desperation. The weave was spreading faster than official doctrine ever could. And the Japanese noticed. Radio intercepts from June 7th described a change in American tactics. Wildcats flying in coordinated pairs, executing unpredictable maneuvers, refusing to die. One intercepted message from a Japanese fighter commander read, "American Wildcat pilots have changed their methods. Expect increased resistance." And he was right. On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 flew combat air patrol over a convoy near Midway. 8 Wildcats. For pairs. At 0832 hours, 14 Zeros attacked. Standard Japanese doctrine, isolate, flank, destroy. They expected chaos. They found geometry. Thach called the weave. All 4 pairs executed. The Zeros dove tried to drag the Americans into turning duels. But every time one committed to a Wildcat's tail, that pilot turned into his wingman. Every time the Zeros tried to split the pair, the Wildcats turned toward each other, not away. 12 minutes of pure aerial choreography. Zeros frustrated. Wildcats synchronized. By the end, 3 Zeros shot down. 2 Wildcats damaged. No Americans killed. It was the first time in Pacific combat that Wildcats had a positive kill ratio against Zeros in a full-scale engagement. Fighter Command finally took notice. On June 15th, Commander John Thach received orders to report to Pearl Harbor. Brief Admiral Chester Nimitz. Explain the weave. Explain why American fighters were finally surviving. Thach arrived on June 18th. He brought diagrams, combat footage, radio logs, pilot testimonials, kill ratios, survival rates. He laid it all out, from 2 matchsticks on a desk to 3 Zeros shot down over Midway. But while Thach was preparing his briefing, Japanese intelligence was preparing a response. They'd studied the weave. They'd watched the pattern. They saw how it worked and how to break it. A new counter-tactic. Not flanking one Wildcat. Flanking both. June 23, 1942. 0815 hours. Santa Cruz Island. Thach's squadron was in the air, fighting Squadron 3, 8 Wildcats, for pairs, and high above them, descending fast, were 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s, executing a new kind of attack. Tactics designed not just to kill Wildcats, but to kill the weave. Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting a convoy when the radar warning came through. 18 bogies inbound. Bearing 312. Distance, 12 miles. Altitude, unknown. Thach counted as Wildcats. 8 aircraft. For pairs. Standard weave formation. He'd briefed Nimitz 3 days earlier, shown in the matches, the math, the maneuver. Nimitz had signed off. Authorized field testing of the weave across the Pacific. Now Thach was about to learn that the Japanese had been studying, too. The Zeros came in high, 16,000 feet, but they didn't dive. They circled, waited. Thach watched them orbit above for 90 long seconds. Unusual. Zeros never waited. Standard doctrine said, use altitude advantage immediately. Dive fast. Kill fast. But these Zeros were holding formation, coordinating. Then Thach understood. They weren't just attacking. They were executing a plan. 6 Zeros broke left. 6 broke right. 6 stayed high. 3 groups. 3 vectors. 3 angles of attack. They'd studied the weave. They knew 2 Wildcats could cover each other from one direction, but not from 3. The trap was sprung at 0817 hours. 6 Zeros dove from high. 6 swept in from the left. 6 raced in from the right. Thach called the weave. Execute. Standard pattern. On me. But his pilots hesitated. Which group do you counter when the enemy is coming from everywhere? Lieutenant Bassett turned into the high group, trying to blunt the dive attack. But in doing so, he exposed his right flank. Ensign Sheedy saw it, broke formation to cover Bassett. Now his own wingman was exposed. The weave collapsed in seconds. For pairs fragmented. 8 Wildcats suddenly flying alone. Exactly what the Japanese had planned. Thach saw it unfolding. Saw the geometry unravel. He snapped the radio open. Reform pairs. Find your wingman. Lock in. Ignore the other groups. Execute standard weave. Trust it. Now. And they did. Bassett located his wingman, hard-banked, locked in. The weave reformed. The high group dove. Bassett turned into his wingman. The lead Zero followed. Right into the crossing guns. A wall of 50 calories tore through the Zero's engine. Explosion midair. Another Zero tried the same pass. Same result. 2 kills in 11 seconds. The weave was working. The left side attack came next. Thach and his wingman locked in, flying the weave like they'd trained it 100 times. 1 Zero committed, and flew straight into Thach's line of fire. Canopy shattered. Black smoke. Dive into the sea. The right side group went for Sheedy's pair. They weaved. Gunfire crossed like scissors. Another Zero down. 5th kill. 8 minutes later, the Zeros broke off. 5 destroyed. 0 Wildcats lost. But Thach wasn't celebrating. He knew exactly what this meant. The Japanese had adapted. They'd studied the weave. Planned a 3-angle coordinated strike. It had failed, but only because his squadron held discipline, because his pilots had trained the pattern until it was instinct. Next time, the Japanese would be smarter. That night, Thach filed a combat report. Described the 3-vector assault. Explained how the weave recovered under pressure. Showed how disciplined pairs could still protect each other, even when fragmented. Recommended immediate, full adoption of the weave across the fleet. No more testing. No more evaluation. The weave worked. Period. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th. Nimitz forwarded it directly to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. Because by now, it was no longer just a tactic. It was a doctrine, born from 2 matchsticks on a desk, and proven in the skies over the Pacific. King read the report. Read the kill ratios. Read the survival statistics. 0 American losses. 5 Japanese kills. 8 Wildcats against 18 Zeros. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a revolution. On June 29, 1942, Admiral Ernest King issued Fleet Order 41 to 1942. Effective immediately, all U.S. Navy fighter squadrons in the Pacific Theater are to adopt the Thach weave as standard combat doctrine. Mandatory in training. Mandatory in combat. The matchstick trick was now U.S. Navy policy. An improvised maneuver born in a San Diego bunk room had just become a pillar of American air combat. But orders from Washington take time. Time to circulate. Time to be understood. Time to be trained. The Japanese weren't waiting. July 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. 12 Wildcats flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field. 6 different squadrons. 6 different levels of experience. 4 pilots had trained on the Thach weave. 8 had not. At 11:20 a.m., radar picked up 32 Japanese Zeros approaching from the north. 4 pilots heard the call, checked position, and locked in. They knew what to do. Find your wingman. Turn in. Start the weave. The other 8? They flew the way they'd been taught before the war. One-on-one engagements. Individual dogfights. Fight alone or die alone. The Zeros attacked at 11:26. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats had been shot down. All 6 were pilots who had fought independently. Pilots who never turned toward their wingmen. Pilots who never crossed. Pilots who never had a chance. The 4 pilots flying the weave. All 4 returned without a scratch. They claimed 7 Zero kills between them. Clean flying. Clean shooting. No mystery. Just math and discipline. Admiral Aubrey Fitch read the combat report. He didn't wait for Washington. Didn't ask permission. Effective immediately, every fighter pilot in the South Pacific will learn the Thach weave. 2 weeks. No exceptions. Training began July 10th. John Thach flew to Guadalcanal. 3 weeks of relentless instruction. Morning briefings. Afternoon flights. Evening debriefs. Repeat. He showed the matches. Drew the diagrams. Flew the pattern. They called him the professor. He taught the weave like a surgeon teaches triage. Not theory. Not style. Survival. Some pilots picked it up in 2 days. Others took a week. But by August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could fly the weave. By September 1st, 214 pilots. And it didn't stop at Guadalcanal. The weave spread. From the Pacific to the Atlantic. From carriers to island bases. From Wildcats to Lightnings, Warhawks. Even bomber crews adapted the pattern for defensive crossing fire. The results were immediate. In June 1942, before the weave became doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.44 against Zeros. That means, for every Zero shot down, 2 Wildcats were lost. But in the months that followed the adoption of the weave, that ratio flipped. By October 1942, U.S. Navy fighters were scoring 1.6 kills for every Wildcat lost. By December, 1-to-1. A tactic born from a pair of matches had shifted the tide of air combat in the Pacific. The Japanese had better planes, better engines, better maneuverability. But American pilots had the weave. And the weave meant you were never flying alone. For every 10 American fighters lost, American pilots shot down 4 Zeros. That was the brutal math before the weave. But by October 1942, after Thach's tactics spread across the Pacific, the ratio flipped. 1-to-1. 2 Japanese Zeros down for every Wildcat lost. The first time in the war American fighters had the edge in the air. Japanese pilots hated it. They could feel the shift, not in tech, but in tactics. Intercepted Japanese transmissions from September were blunt. Do not commit to tail chase. Do not follow American fighters into wingman's fire. Disengage if Americans execute coordination tactics. They'd studied the weave. They understood what it meant. Chasing a Wildcat now meant flying into a trap. The trap worked. Even the best Zero pilots couldn't beat it consistently. But disengaging meant giving up the kill. Letting American bombers reach their targets. Losing air superiority. The Zero was still faster. Still more agile. Still the better aircraft on paper. But speed and agility meant nothing if you couldn't get guns on target. And the weave made it nearly impossible to get guns on target. By January 1943, the weave wasn't just a trick. It was doctrine. U.S. Navy squadrons flew it from every carrier in the Pacific. Army Air Force pilots practiced it in Warhawks and P-38s. Marine aviators learned it at Guadalcanal and Henderson Field. Even the British Royal Navy started teaching it aboard their carriers. The tactic that started with 2 wooden matches on a desk in San Diego had become the backbone of Allied air defense. In February 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Thach received the Navy Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of U.S. naval aviation operations. Thach appreciated the medal, but he didn't care about decorations. He cared about numbers. In the 6 months before the weave, 137 Wildcats lost in combat with zeros. In the 6 months after the weave became doctrine, 41 Wildcats lost, 96 pilots who came home, 96 mothers who didn't get telegrams, because 2 aircraft turned toward each other instead of away. In March 1943, Fighter Command reassigned Thach, pulled him out of combat, sent him back to San Diego, back to the same desk where he'd once stared at a box of matches. His new orders: train, instruct, teach the weave to every new pilot in the fleet. Thach hated it. Hated being pulled from the fight. Hated not flying with his squadron. But high command was clear. You're more valuable teaching the trick than using it. So he taught. Every day for 18 months. Thach walked into classrooms, picked up 2 wooden matches, and showed the next generation of pilots how to stay alive. He taught the weave to over 800 naval aviators. Every one of those pilots took it to combat. Every one of them survived situations they shouldn't have survived. And every one of them told other pilots about the commander who saved their lives with matchsticks. The war ended in August 1945. Lieutenant Commander John Thach was 40 years old. He'd flown 73 combat missions, scored 6 confirmed kills, earned the Navy Cross, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Air Medals. But none of those medals meant more to him than one number. Over 2,000 American pilots survived the war because they knew how to weave. After VJ Day, Thach faced a choice: stay in the Navy or go home. His wife wanted him back. His children barely knew him. He'd been gone for 4 years. But staying in the Navy meant more than orders, more than duty. It meant more lives saved. So what does a man do after saving 2,000 pilots with a box of matches? When the shooting stops, he keeps teaching. Thach stayed in the Navy. He couldn't walk away. Not from the pilots who still needed him. Not from the training rooms. Not from the chalkboards and flight briefings, where new lives were still being written. He spent the next 27 years doing what he did best: training fighter pilots, developing tactics, saving lives. Without firing a single shot, the Navy promoted him. Commander in 1946, Captain in 1952, Rear Admiral in 1960. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War. Never flew combat again, but his pilots did, and every one of them knew the weave. By the 1950s, fighter pilots just called it the Thach, the only dogfighting tactic in military history, named after its inventor while he was still alive. During Vietnam, the tactic evolved. F-4 Phantom pilots adapted it for supersonic speeds. They called it fluid 4 formation, but the core was the same. 2 aircraft, cross, reverse, cover each other. The MiG-17 could outturn the F-4, just like the Zero had outturned the Wildcat. But it didn't matter. The weave worked at 600 miles per hour, just like it worked at 300. John Thach retired in 1973. 4-star Admiral. 40 years of service. Countless lives saved. He moved back to San Diego, lived quietly, didn't talk much about the war, didn't talk about Midway or Guadalcanal, or the 2,000 names he carried with him. When reporters asked about the weave, he always gave the same answer. It wasn't genius. It was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home. That's what John Thach used to say. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of the first combat test of the weave, fighter pilots would call him. Men from every corner of the country, some long retired, some still flying, all with the same message. The weave saved my life. You saved my wingman. We made it home because of you. Thach never forgot a name, never cut the calls short. He listened to every story like it was the first time he'd heard it. In 1981, the Navy named a building after him. Thach Hall, Naval Air Station, Pensacola, the home of naval fighter pilot training. Every aviator who earns their wings walks past a bronze plaque with 3 words engraved beneath his name: innovate, adapt, survive. John Thach died on April 15, 2001. He was 86 years old. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators. Some had flown Wildcats in 1943. Some had flown Phantoms over Vietnam. Some had flown Hornets in Desert Storm. Different planes, different wars. But they all had one thing in common. They were alive. Because one man thought about matchsticks. Today, The Thach weave is still taught at every U.S. fighter pilot school. Navy, Air Force, Marines. Modern aircraft fly faster. They fight beyond visual range. But the core idea hasn't changed. Two aircraft, turning toward each other, crossing paths, surviving together. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Thach's original matchbox sits inside a small glass case, next to a scale model of a Wildcat. The label reads, Lieutenant Commander John Thach used these matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups pass by it every day. Most don't stop, but fighter pilots do. They always stop. They look at the matches, and they understand. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every click helps more people find this story. Subscribe to join our community of history keepers. We're here to rescue the real stories from the dust of forgotten archives. Stories of pilots and commanders who saved lives with nothing but geometry, steel, and courage. Real people, real heroism, never forgotten.